There's a special kind of arrogance that comes with power. The kind that makes you believe you can do whatever you want, take whatever you want, and destroy whoever you want, all while hiding behind a clipboard and a smile. Her name was Margaret Thornton. She was 65, wore designer blazers that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had been the president of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association for nearly a decade. To the residents of Lakeview Estates, she was the ultimate authority, the queen of suburban justice, the woman who could make your life a living hell with nothing more than a pen and a stack of violation notices. But Margaret wasn't content with just fining people for unmowed lawns or unauthorized mailboxes. Margaret had discovered something far more profitable. She had learned that if you controlled the HOA, you could control who lived in the neighborhood. You could decide who belonged and who didn't. And if a property happened to be vacant, well, who was really going to stop you from making a little money on the side? That's what she told herself, anyway. That's what she told her cousin Roger, a deadbeat with a criminal record and a complete lack of shame. It's just sitting there, she said. The owner never comes. He won't even notice. She was wrong. His name was Ethan Callahan. To the residents of Lakeview Estates, he was the quiet guy who owned the lakefront cabin at the end of the cul-de-sac. He showed up maybe twice a year, spent a weekend fishing, and disappeared back to wherever he came from. Nobody knew much about him. Nobody asked. What they didn't know was that Ethan Callahan was a detective with the state police, a man who had spent 15 years hunting down the worst kinds of criminals, a man who had seen every con, every scam, every trick in the book, a man who had a very particular set of skills and a very particular cousin. His cousin Jake was an FBI agent, a special agent with the Cyber Crimes Division, to be precise. A man who had spent his career tracking down white-collar criminals, dismantling fraud rings, and putting away people who thought they were too smart to get caught. And Margaret Thornton had just handed them both the case of a lifetime. This is the story of how a small-town HOA Karen tried to steal a lake house and ended up facing federal charges, asset seizure, and the full, undivided attention of the United States government. Ethan Callahan had always loved the lake. Growing up, his family had spent every summer at a rented cabin on the shores of Lake Michigan. Those were the best days of his life, fishing with his father, swimming with his siblings, sitting around the campfire at night while the stars wheeled overhead. It was peaceful. It was simple. It was home. So when he inherited a small lakefront cabin from his late uncle, he knew he had struck gold. It wasn't much, a modest 3-bedroom structure with a screened-in porch, a dock, and a stunning view of the water. But to Ethan, it was paradise. A place to escape the chaos of his job, to decompress, to remember what life was supposed to feel like. He used it as a weekend retreat. He'd drive up from the city on Friday evenings, spend the weekend fishing and reading and doing absolutely nothing, and drive back on Sunday night. It was his sanctuary, his refuge, the one place in the world where he could truly relax. The HOA was a necessary evil. Lakeview Estates had been built in the 1980s as an upscale lakeside community, and like most such communities, it came with a set of rules. Ethan paid his dues on time, kept his property in good condition, and stayed out of the neighborhood drama. He had no interest in the petty politics of the HOA. He just wanted to enjoy his cabin in peace. But Margaret Thornton had other plans. Margaret had been the HOA president for 9 years. In that time, she had turned the organization from a simple community association into a personal fiefdom. She had handpicked the board. She had rewritten the bylaws to give herself more power. She had created a network of informants who reported every minor infraction directly to her. She also had a side business that nobody knew about. Margaret had discovered that vacant properties in Lakeview Estates were a gold mine. If an owner didn't visit often, who would notice if the locks were changed? Who would notice if a few guests moved in? Who would notice if the property was quietly rented out to someone who paid cash and asked no questions? It was the perfect crime. Low risk, high reward, and Margaret had been getting away with it for years. Then she set her sights on Ethan's cabin. It was a Friday evening in late June when Ethan pulled up to his cabin. He had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. His caseload had been brutal, A string of armed robberies that had kept him working 12-hour days for a month. He needed a break. He needed the lake. He needed to sit on his porch with a cold beer and watch the sunset. But when he turned onto his street, something felt wrong. His driveway had a car in it. A beat-up old sedan with a cracked windshield and a bumper held on with duct tape. The kind of car that screamed, "I have no business being here." Ethan parked on the street and approached his cabin cautiously. His hand drifted instinctively toward his hip, where his service weapon usually sat. But he was off duty. He was carrying a fishing rod, not a gun. He walked up to his front door and froze. The lock was different. The old deadbolt he had installed himself had been replaced with a cheap brass lock that looked like it came from a hardware store clearance bin. The door had a new brass knob, and through the window he could see movement. Someone was inside his cabin. Ethan knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door swung open to reveal a man in his 40s, unshaven, overweight, wearing a stained t-shirt and shorts. Behind him, Ethan could see the chaos of a family that had clearly been living in his cabin for a while. Dishes in the sink, laundry on the floor, a television blaring in the living room. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone belligerent. Ethan blinked. "This is my cabin." "Who are you?" The man's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your cabin, buddy. I rented this place fair and square. Got a lease and everything." "A lease," Ethan repeated flatly. "From who?" "From the HOA, the man said, as if that explained everything. "Margaret Thornton. She runs the place. She said the owner never comes here, and she had the authority to rent it out. So I paid her 6 months' rent in cash." Ethan felt a cold fury building in his chest. He had heard stories about corrupt HOAs. Who hadn't? But this was something else entirely. This was theft. This was fraud. This was a crime. He took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. "I'm the owner," he said. "I've owned this cabin for 10 years. Margaret Thornton had no right to rent it out. You need to leave." The man laughed. "Yeah, right. You got any proof?" Ethan pulled out his phone and started scrolling through photos. There he was, standing in front of the cabin 5 years ago. There was the deed, saved in his documents folder. There were the property tax receipts. The man's face went pale. "Look, man, I didn't know. I just paid the lady. She said it was legit." "Where is she now?" Ethan asked. "HOA office, probably. She's there most days." Ethan nodded slowly. He had a choice to make. He could call the police right now, have this squatter arrested, and start the long, messy process of eviction. But that would take weeks, months maybe, and Margaret Thornton would have plenty of time to cover her tracks. Or he could play a longer game, a smarter game, a game that would end with Margaret Thornton regretting the day she ever set eyes on his property. He looked at the man, Roger, he would later learn, and made a decision. "Here's what's going to happen," Ethan said, his voice calm and measured. "You're going to pack up your things and leave my cabin. I'm not going to call the police. I'm not going to press charges. But you're going to leave, and you're going to tell Margaret Thornton that the owner came by." Roger hesitated. "And what about my rent? I paid her 6 months' worth." "That's between you and Margaret," Ethan said. "I suggest you get your money back." Roger nodded slowly. He clearly wanted to argue, but something in Ethan's eyes told him that wasn't a good idea. "All right, man. All right. Give me a day to pack up." "You have until tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "And Roger, if I come back and you're still here, I'm calling the sheriff. And I'm pressing charges. Understood?" "Understood." Ethan turned and walked back to his car. He didn't go home. He drove straight to his cousin Jake's house. Jake Callahan lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of house that screamed FBI agent, neat, unassuming, and utterly forgettable. The perfect cover. Ethan had known Jake his whole life. They had grown up together, gone to the same schools, played on the same baseball teams. They had both gone into law enforcement, though they had taken different paths. Ethan had joined the state police. Jake had gone federal. They were close. The kind of close that meant they could finish each other's sentences. The kind of close that meant Jake could take one look at Ethan's face and know something was very, very wrong. "Lake House?" Jake asked, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. Lake house, Ethan confirmed. Jake handed him a glass. Tell me everything. Ethan did. He told Jake about the changed locks, the squatter, the lease. He told Jake about Margaret Thornton and her little side business. He told Jake about the rage he felt, the cold, simmering fury that had been building since the moment he saw that beat-up car in his driveway. Jake listened without interrupting. When Ethan was finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. Let me get this straight, Jake said. This HOA president, Margaret Thornton, she changed the locks on your cabin, rented it out to her cousin, and pocketed the cash. And she's been doing this to other properties? That's what I'm guessing, Ethan said. Roger, the squatter, said she does this all the time. Finds vacant properties, changes the locks, rents them out. Nobody notices because the owners barely come. Jake nodded slowly. That's not just theft. That's fraud. Wire fraud, probably. And if she's using the mail or electronic communications to do it. That's federal, Ethan finished. Exactly. Jake took a sip of his whiskey. You want my help? Ethan smiled grimly. That's why I'm here. Jake set down his glass and pulled out his phone. All right, let's start digging. But first, I need you to do something for me. What's that? I need you to go back to that cabin and take pictures. Everything. The changed locks, the squatter stuff, the lease if he'll show it to you. I need documentation. You already know what I mean. I need all the evidence. And I need it yesterday. Ethan nodded. Consider it done. And Ethan. Jake added. Don't do anything stupid. I know you're angry. I know you want to hurt her. But we're going to do this the right way. The federal way. And by the time we're done, Margaret Thornton is going to wish she'd never heard of Lakeview Estates. The next few weeks were a masterclass in federal investigation. Jake used his FBI resources to dig into Margaret Thornton's background. What he found was a gold mine of criminal activity. Margaret had been running her scheme for at least 5 years. She had targeted dozens of vacant properties in Lakeview Estates, changing locks, forging leases, and renting them out to unsuspecting tenants. She had pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. She had laundered the money through a shell company she had set up specifically for that purpose. But that wasn't all. Jake discovered that Margaret had also been embezzling from the HOA itself. She had been skimming community funds for years, funneling money into her personal accounts through a web of fake invoices and phony contractors. She had stolen from her neighbors, from the people who had trusted her to run their community fairly. And she had done it all with a smile on her face. Jake documented everything. He pulled financial records. He interviewed witnesses. He built a case that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. Meanwhile, Ethan was doing his own digging. He had gone back to the cabin and taken hundreds of photos. He had tracked down other victims, other property owners who had been ripped off by Margaret and never even knew it. He had built a list of every tenant who had been scammed into renting a property that wasn't theirs to rent. It was a mountain of evidence. And it was all pointing straight at Margaret Thornton. But Jake and Ethan weren't done yet. They wanted to catch Margaret in the act. They wanted her to know, really know, that she had been caught. So they set a trap. The plan was simple. Jake had a colleague in the FBI's undercover operations division, a woman named Sarah who specialized in sting operations. She was perfect for the role. Professional, unassuming, and utterly convincing. Sarah posed as a wealthy retiree looking to buy a vacation home in Lakeview Estates. She contacted Margaret directly, expressing interest in a quiet, low-maintenance property that she could use a few times a year. Margaret took the bait immediately. She showed Sarah several properties that were available for rent, all of them, unbeknownst to Sarah, owned by unsuspecting victims. Margaret gave Sarah a tour, talking up the amenities, the views, the peace and quiet. She offered Sarah a special deal if she paid in cash up front. Sarah played along perfectly. She asked questions. She nodded at the right moments. She made Margaret feel like she was closing the deal of a lifetime. And, all the while, she was recording everything. Jake and Ethan watched from a surveillance van parked down the street. They had audio feeds, video feeds, everything they needed to build an airtight case. Look at her, Ethan said, shaking his head. She's so proud of herself. She's about to be a lot less proud, Jake replied. Just wait. The final piece of the puzzle came when Margaret offered Sarah a special property that had just come available. A lakeside cabin at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The owner never came, Margaret explained. It was perfect for someone who wanted privacy. Sarah asked to see the property. Margaret led her to Ethan's cabin. Ethan felt his blood boil as he watched Margaret unlock the door she had illegally rekeyed, and show Sarah around his home. This is beautiful, Sarah said, playing her part perfectly. How much is the rent? Margaret named a figure. It was well below market value, cheap enough to be tempting, expensive enough to be profitable. Sarah nodded. I'll take it. I can pay in cash. Margaret's smile was triumphant. Excellent. I'll have the lease drawn up right away. Actually, Sarah said, her tone shifting slightly, I have a few questions about the lease. Could you come to my car? I have some paperwork I'd like you to look at. Margaret hesitated for just a moment. Then she shrugged and followed Sarah to the car. The moment she stepped inside, the doors locked behind her. Margaret didn't see it coming. She was too busy counting her money, metaphorically anyway, to notice that something was wrong. She was probably already planning how she was going to spend the cash from her latest rental. Then Sarah pulled out her badge. Margaret Thornton, Sarah said, her voice now cold and official. You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Margaret's face went white. What is this? Who are you? FBI, Sarah said. And you're in a lot of trouble. The door of the surveillance van opened. Jake stepped out, followed by Ethan. Hello, Margaret, Ethan said, his voice calm but his eyes blazing. Remember me? I'm the owner of that cabin you just tried to rent out. The one you changed the locks on. The one you let your cousin live in for 6 months. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. This is a misunderstanding. I had the authority to. You had no authority, Jake interrupted. You had a scheme. A scheme that's been running for at least 5 years. A scheme that's defrauded dozens of property owners out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. A scheme that you funded with embezzled HOA funds. I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret stammered. Funny, Jake said, pulling out a thick folder. Because I've got bank statements, forged leases, witness statements, and about 100 hours of surveillance footage that say otherwise. Margaret's face went from white to red to a shade of purple that Ethan had only ever seen in cartoons. You can't do this, she sputtered. I'm the HOA president. I'm respected in this community. We're respected, Ethan corrected. Past tense. By the time we're done, the only thing you'll be respected for is being the woman who got caught. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She had finally realized the truth. Her reign was over. Her scheme had been exposed, and the full weight of the federal government was about to come crashing down on her head. The news spread through Lakeview estates like wildfire. Within hours of Margaret's arrest, the community was in an uproar. People who had lived in fear of her for years suddenly found their voices. They came forward with stories of their own, fines that had been fabricated, rules that had been invented on the spot, threats that had been whispered in dark corners. The HOA board, which had been Margaret's personal puppet show, quickly dissolved. New elections were held. New leadership was installed. The residents of Lakeview Estates finally had a chance to rebuild their community on a foundation of fairness and transparency. Margaret's cousin Roger was arrested too. He had been running his own little scheme, renting out properties that Margaret had secured and pocketing a cut of the profits. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and faced his own prison sentence. The federal charges against Margaret were staggering. Wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, criminal trespass, theft, larceny, tampering with property without authority, conspiracy to commit fraud. The list went on and on. She faced decades in federal prison, not to mention the loss of her home, her assets, and everything she had built. But the real victory, as far as Ethan was concerned, was the closure. He got his cabin back. The locks were changed, legally this time, and he finally had the peace of mind to enjoy it again. He spent that weekend on his porch, fishing rod in hand, watching the sunset over the lake. And for the first time in months, he smiled. The residents of Lakeview Estates held a block party to celebrate Margaret's downfall. It was a potluck, the kind of small-town gathering that had once been a regular occurrence before Margaret had made everyone too afraid to socialize. People brought dishes from home. Someone set up a grill. A neighbor with a guitar played folk songs while the children ran through the sprinklers. Ethan attended, though he was still getting used to the idea of being a local hero. People kept coming up to him, shaking his hand, thanking him for what he had done. "You saved this community," one neighbor said. "We were all so scared of her. None of us had the courage to stand up." "I just wanted my cabin back," Ethan said with a shrug. The rest was just icing on the cake. Another neighbor, an elderly woman named Beatrice, approached him with tears in her eyes. "I've lived here for 30 years, she said. "I've never felt safe in my own home. Not with her in charge. But now I can finally relax." Ethan put a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now, Beatrice. We all are." The block party continued into the night. Laughter echoed through the streets. Music floated on the warm summer air. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Lakeview Estates felt like a real community. Margaret Thornton's trial was a sensation. The local news covered it. The national news covered it. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up to bullies. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: forged leases, bank statements, witness testimony, surveillance footage. Margaret's defense team tried everything they could to discredit the case, but it was no use. The evidence was too strong. The case was too airtight. Margaret was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Her assets were seized. Her reputation was destroyed. And the HOA she had once ruled with an iron fist was now a model of democratic governance. Ethan watched the verdict from the gallery. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a tinge of sadness. Margaret had been a bully, a thief, and a liar. But she had also been a person who had let power corrupt her beyond recognition. He thought about what had driven her to this point. Was it greed? Was it insecurity? Was it simply the intoxication of power? He would never know. And in the end, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that justice had been served. What mattered was that the victims had finally been heard. What mattered was that Lakeview Estates could finally heal. Ethan Callahan still owns his lake cabin. He still goes there on weekends, still fishes off the dock, still watches the sunset from his porch. But now, when he walks through the neighborhood, people wave. They smile. They invite him to block parties and barbecues. He's not just the guy with the cabin anymore. He's the guy who stood up to the bully. The guy who brought down the HOA president. The guy who proved that even the most powerful tyrant can be defeated. And his cousin Jake? He's still an FBI agent, still hunting down white-collar criminals, still putting away the people who think they're too smart to get caught. But he's got a new favorite story to tell at parties. What do you think? If you were Ethan, would you have gone to the FBI? Or would you have handled it differently? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story made you cheer, please give a like, subscribe to Revenge Doctrine, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of justice, karma, and the ultimate power of the underdog. Because sometimes the best weapon you have is a badge.